Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and this is the first video in a series about overall strategy in Arkham Horror the card game. The series, as is the channel, is named after the card Quick Learner, which essentially makes skill tests harder at the beginning of your turn, but then a lot easier at the end of your turn. That's pretty much how I felt about learning this game. At first, I found the game extremely challenging, but after some time and practice, I've learned about the specific challenges the game revolves around, and I've had more fun and won more often. My goal for this channel, and this series in particular, is the same. With a little bit of discussion about strategy, you too can become a quick learner and have a better time winning the game. Let me outline a little bit more about my philosophy about the game and how I'm going to approach talking about it in the various videos here. I play at standard difficulty, but I don't think the difficulty we play at changes the nature of the game's challenges very much. You can be a little bit more reckless with the Chaos Bag on easy, and playing on hard or expert will change your approach a little bit with the deck building, but ultimately the game is about what you're able to do with your actions. If you're just starting out, it's fine to play on easy for a while, but there's not much of a difference between easy and standard once you've become more comfortable with the mechanics of the game and your collection of player cards is larger. I do think the player count changes the relative impact of some player cards and is worthy of discussion. I most often play 2 and 3 player, although I've played some 4-player games and a few single investigator games. If I'm playing solo, I prefer to play 2-handed solo, meaning I control 2 investigators by myself. Anyways, as an example, if you're playing one investigator, many locations only have 1 clue on them. Cards that pick up 2 clues at once become a little less useful. But if you're playing 2-player, these cards are very useful because 2 clue locations are common, and you can clear out those locations by yourself without the other investigator wasting time moving into that location with you. In these guides, I'm not interested in talking about the most broken cards or combos. I'm not going to focus much on the relative strength of cards or rating them in any way, because I think that almost all investigators, cards, and playstyles are useful and viable with the right deck and the right team. Not every card has to go in every deck for it to be good. In fact, I tend to have more fun trying to use cards I haven't played before and making them shine in the right circumstance. That said, some cards and investigators are generally more useful and consistent across most situations you'll run into, and we will talk about that. In general, I think new players need to know that there should be a certain density of useful cards in their deck, but niche cards definitely have their moments. Overall, I think this game is supposed to be fun, not frustrating. I know a lot of people have pegged this game as being ruthlessly difficult, but I don't think that's the intent of the designers at all, especially at this point in the game. Instead, I think the designers want you to pay attention to the specific challenges posed by the game and work with your team to best solve them. It takes a little bit of time to get a handle on what the game is asking you to do and how to do it. In just about every scenario, you're asked to discover clues on locations to progress the game. You are slowed down by encounter cards, which sometimes are enemies. Usually about 30% of the encounter cards are enemies. Deck building and gameplay should be informed by these objectives and the challenges the game puts forth. If you're all set up to deal with enemies, but there are no enemies on the board, you need to help out with the objectives and not be dead weight either. This is a little more related to deck building and team composition, which I'll cover in another video. There's still a lot of randomness in the game. You don't know what chaos token you'll pull, you don't know what cards you'll draw from the deck, and you don't know what encounter cards you'll draw either. That's what makes the game fun, and not just a mathematical problem to solve the same way every time. But all of these challenges are not insurmountable, and the goal doesn't always have to be to 100% every scenario either. Just make it out without being defeated. So, the first few quick learner guides are focusing explicitly on the challenges that Arkham Horror poses to the players. No matter the objectives or the role your investigator is playing, you need to think about 3 things in order to progress the game and not lose the scenario. 1 is beating the doom clock. Every round, the agenda collects 1 doom. If the agenda deck runs out, the game is over, and you stop playing the game. If you are moving too slowly, the doom will catch up with you and prematurely end the scenario. Second is passing skill tests. No matter what you do, you will need to make skill tests to fight enemies or pick up clues. Barring that, the game sometimes forces skill tests upon you with encounter cards or other effects. If you can't pass tests, you won't be able to progress the game, and you'll fall behind in pace. Finally, you'll need to manage your resources. This includes the actual resource tokens you have to pay for cards and other effects, but also the cards you have in hand, and your total health and sanity that you have to absorb attacks or other effects that deal you damage or horror. Now, the game tries to beat you in all three categories beyond the inherent difficulties I just talked about. While you might have your eye on the doom clock on the agenda, the game will sometimes unexpectedly shorten the game entirely, most famously with a card like Ancient Evils, which will lose the whole team around. You'll also get slowed down with enemies, which will demand your attention immediately. Next, while you might be prepared to pass tests of an average difficulty, usually 3, sometimes the game makes you pass a much higher difficulty test, like 5. Or the game will unexpectedly reduce your skill values, making it harder to pass all tests. Finally, the game will attack your resources directly, making you discard cards, lose resources or actions, or deal you damage and or horror, putting you perilously close to being defeated. But, knowing all of the ways that the game tries to mess with you, you can be prepared with a solution for all of them. Okay, finally time to get into the topic of this video. We're focusing on that first challenge, beating the doom clock. And the best way to make sure you don't run out of time is to have enough action compression. Action compression means doing more with your actions than you could have by just taking basic actions. If a basic investigate action only picks up 1 clue, then any card effect that picks up 2 clues instead is twice as efficient. Staying ahead of the game is a cornerstone of winning the game. The faster you can pick up clues and progress the game, the fewer encounter cards you draw that would slow you down. Ideally, the way to go faster is to play cards that enable action compression. Keeping an eye on action compression helps us in our deck building and in our in-game tactics, especially with enemy management, as we'll talk about later. Finally, it's worth saying that scenario actions, like moving from one location to another, or using abilities on scenario cards, slow us down, but are unavoidable. Let's prove the point of how much action compression can put you ahead of the game with a simple example from Night of the Zealot, the core set campaign. Let's imagine the game with no cards at all. All you can do is investigate, move, and use the activate action on scenario cards. This provides us with a nice baseline to make sure that spending actions playing cards isn't just wasting our time. So, let's say Daisy Walker is in a 3 investigator team, and she's in charge of clues. How quickly can she get all of the clues the team needs with no other abilities other than her base stats? We'll look at the Midnight Masks, the classic second scenario from the core set. This scenario has 14 rounds, or 42 actions per investigator. The investigators need to spend 30 clues to draw all 5 cultists from the cultist deck. If someone else spends the action to spend the clues, Daisy can pick up 30 clues in roughly 36 actions if she is successful in every investigate action and spends the other actions moving from location to location. Let's see how that would work. As you can see, most of these locations have 3 clues on them, since this is a 3-player game. Daisy starts at your house and investigates 3 times for 3 clues. In round 2, she moves first to Rivertown, and then investigates twice for 2 more clues. Then, in round 3, she picks up the last clue on Rivertown, then moves to Southside, and investigates again for her last action. Finally, in round 4, she'll investigate 2 more times to pick up the last 2 clues, and then move again to start the cycle all over again. So our pace is basically every 4 rounds, 9 clues. You can see how the move actions really waste a lot of time, especially if you have to move to a location you've already been to before. Let's see if we can do better than this with a card effect. Let's look at Fingerprint Kit, a card from the Circle Undone. It costs us an action and 4 resources to play it from our hand, but it expedites our clue getting. Once per turn, we can exhaust the card to investigate and discover 2 clues instead of 1. Let's see how this helps out in our example. In round 1, we do need to play the card for our first action. Then we can use it to investigate and get 2 clues. For our third action, we'll do a basic investigate to get the last clue. At this point, we're at the exact same pace as if we hadn't used the fingerprint kit at all, which is not ideal. In round 2, we move to Rivertown, then use the fingerprint kit again for 2 clues, and then pick up the last clue with a basic investigate for our last action. Now we're ahead of our original pace by 1 action. Now round 3. We can move to Southside and then get the last 3 clues with our last 2 actions. Now our pace is pretty good. 3 rounds, 9 clues. However, we've used up all the supplies on the fingerprint kit, and worse, we're still stuck at a location without any clues. All in all, we've only saved ourselves 2 actions. Let's throw in one more card to the mix, Shortcut, a card from the Dunwich Legacy, which will let us move to a connecting location without spending any actions. It's an event, so we can only use it once, but let's pretend we have 2 of them in our hand. Round 1 looks just like the last time, where we play and use fingerprint kit. For round 2, we'll move to Rivertown by playing Shortcut. Now we can pick up all the clues on Rivertown and then move to Southside with our last action. In round 3, we can spend the first 2 actions clearing off the clues, and then we can use our third action to play another copy of fingerprint kit. After all, we need to get 30 clues, and we only have 9 so far. We'll finish off by playing another shortcut to move back to Rivertown to get ready to move someplace else. Granted, we've played 2 copies of each of the cards we've highlighted here, so we'll need some other tricks to keep getting clues at this breakneck pace. Or maybe we don't need to keep up this pace, because, well, this example isn't really Arkham Horror. The encounter deck will make you lose clues or move to locations you didn't really want to go to. This is the kind of slowdown that the game imposes on you with encounter cards. But it's okay, because you're making up for that by going very quickly with your own cards. Of course, your deck includes 30 plus cards, not just the ones you want right now. This is what makes card draw and card search effects so powerful. And of course, passing skill tests isn't a given either. Even at 5 intellect, Daisy Walker will still fail some tests. And looking at these other locations on the Midnight Masks map, she will need some help from cards to investigate these higher shroud locations. And what will she do if an obscuring fog shows up on one of them? Well, we'll talk about passing skill tests in another video. Okay, if the name of the game is Action Compression, let's talk about all the actions available to every investigator and where we can get the most value out of our time. Remember, by default, we only have 3 actions available to take every turn. Play and activate are actions that I like to call the card actions, because they end up playing cards or using actions on cards themselves, like what we saw with Fingerprint Kit. Most of these actions will indeed help with action compression. Note that triggered abilities can be investigate or fight actions too. A basic investigate action is also good and very common. Remember that we ran out of supplies very quickly in our fingerprint kit, so we had to supplement it with a basic investigate action too. Don't feel bad about making basic investigate tests, especially if you almost always will pass. You can also do a basic fight or evade action. You prefer to use weapons or events to fight so you can do more than 1 damage and have a better chance to hit, but using a basic evade action is very common. You're also able to draw 1 card or gain 1 resource with an action. As we'll see shortly, these actions have very low value. If you find yourself taking these actions often, you should include more cards in your deck that draw you multiple cards or gain multiple resources. If you're taking these options because you have nothing else to do to progress the scenario, there's likely a problem with your deck building or team makeup. That said, sometimes you need a resource, and you need it now, so it's nice to have it as available as an option. Finally, we have the move action, which is a pretty weak action, but you'll need to do it, especially on larger maps. As we saw with Shortcut though, there are a good number of cards that allow you to move without spending an action. Let's continue to talk about how much your actions are worth in terms of how the game views resources. Over and over again, the game indicates that drawing one card is equivalent to gaining two resources. There are many card effects that let you choose between drawing one card or gaining two resources. This is also another example that indicates that taking one resource as an action is a very weak action. Now, the game also suggests that spending a card from your hand and an action is the equivalent to gaining three resources, seen here in the ubiquitous economy card, Emergency Cash. This neutral card is good value, but cards in class like Motivational Speech are even better value. This card combines a play action with the effect of Emergency Cash, although there is a condition. The three resources must be spent on playing an ally. When combining gaining resources with a basic action, you only end up getting two resources. Still, there's a pattern here. Playing a card from your hand should be the equivalent of at least two actions, or more if one of those actions you save is the resource action. For Scout Ahead, you combine three move actions into one card, but this time you also need to spend a resource. And finally, with Swift Reflexes, we turn the equation on its head. Spending two resources in a card is how much a single action is worth, although Swift Reflexes lets you take that extra action out of the normal turn sequence, so it probably is worth slightly more. So, how much are actions worth? I won't try to come up with a distinct formula here, but it's clear that the game values resources, card draw, and move actions less highly than other types of actions. In general, basic actions are not worth much. Instead, cards can give you the greatest value for your actions, whether that's playing cards or activating abilities on ones you've already played. This, of course, isn't surprising since we are playing a card game. But which cards help the most? Let's quickly remind ourselves of the three types of player cards in the game: assets, events, and skills. Assets require an action to play, but with enough or unlimited uses, you get action compression for several more rounds. Our fingerprint kit from earlier is an excellent example of this in action. Event cards cost one action to trigger their strong effect, but it only happens once. Let's quickly compare two cards to look at the relative strength of events and assets. There's a lot of text on Spectral Razor, but essentially you pay 2 resources to deal 3 damage to an enemy with a significant skill boost. This is likely the strongest fight card at level 0, and to find its equivalent asset you have to look for a level 5 card in Shriveling. 5 XP essentially gets you 4 Spectral Razors for only an initial investment of 1 action and 3 resources. In other words, if you're going to include events in your deck, they should involve the kind of action compression that makes it worth playing only once. Back to our last type of card, skills. They cost no actions or resources. Some only help you pass a test, while others may give you some action compression, like drawing a card if the test passes. Like events, the effect only happens once. In a generic 30-card deck, you might include 14 assets, 10 events, and 6 skills, because the assets and events give you the most action compression by their nature. Of course, some investigators and deck styles will alter these basics considerably. We'll come back to this in another video. We've gone over the types of cards that help out with action compression. Now let's give a few examples of the types of action compression you should be looking out for. First, cards that are fast or give you a benefit without spending an action. While most assets and events cost an action, they also can be fast. Here, Magnifying Glass asks for only 1 resource and a hand slot to benefit from its skill boost for the rest of the game. Next, cards that let you take an extra action or the equivalent thereof. As an example, instead of spending an action to draw a card, you can have Arcane Initiate draw you a card every single round, as long as that card is a spell card. Next, cards that combine more than 1 action into 1. We already saw a number of these earlier with the cards that combined resource generation and action, but here's an example of combining a fight and an evade. Next, cards that give you clues or deal damage without taking a test. These are the two most important things your deck should be doing anyways, and skipping an extra skill test means that you won't fail a test. Vicious Blow is a little bit of a strange example, but essentially, if you're going to take two basic fight actions to deal 2 damage, why not just commit Vicious Blow and only spend 1 action? Next, cards that avoid or mitigate failing a skill test. A failed skill test is at minimum a wasted action. You'll have to spend another action to retake the test. Think of Lucky as a way to gain an action back, and not even have to be afraid of failing your redo of the test. Finally, cards that do 2 or more of the above. This starts to happen once you sink some experience points into cards. Get Over Here level 2 potentially saves you 2 movement actions, an engage action, and a fight action. And it is fast. So instead of spending 4 actions, spend 0 instead. That's a lot of value. Okay, speaking of engaging and attacking, a short interlude about enemy management. While action compression is great everywhere, it is crucial for dealing with enemies that are engaged with you. They have a different clock, as it were, the end of the investigator phase. If the enemies aren't defeated or exhausted by then, you will take some damage and or horror. That isn't the end of the world once or twice, but if you want to take other actions, they will keep attacking you first. So, getting extra actions or doing 2+ damage attacks is important for avoiding taking the attacks. Don't include any weapons or spell assets that can't deal extra damage in your deck. One of the more common ways for a scenario to end is to be swarmed by too many enemies. This can happen if the encounter deck is unkind and you drew several enemies in a row without being able to dispatch any of them. Cards like Dynamite Blast are an excellent panic button to clear a room. Finally, if you have some evasion on your team, a quicker way to deal with enemies is to evade them, leave the room, and never come back. If the enemies have Hunter, then it is possible to never let them catch up on big enough maps. Here's an excellent card with a lot of action compression. Survival Instinct solves the problem where sometimes you get locked out of the game because you are engaged with 3 or more enemies that you can't kill. With only 3 actions, if you evade all 3, you won't be able to leave your location, so you'll repeat this process next round. With this card, just 1 action evades them all, and you get to move. We looked at many cards and card types that help with action compression. In fact, most cards really do help with action compression a lot, but some do not. So let's look at some pitfalls for when a card is not worth playing or not even worth putting into your deck. By no means does this make the following cards bad. In fact, some of them are great. This section simply means you need to think about how to get the most value out of them. First, cards that only help pass a test. I think Unexpected Courage is a fine card, but if you commit to a test that you would have passed anyways, the card did nothing for you, and it's gone forever. Compare it to Magnifying Glass, which only gives you a +1 skill boost, but you can use it on every investigation for the rest of the game. Unexpected Courage has its places, but you should be able to do much better, especially once you upgrade your deck. Physical training and the like seem like a solution to the problem I have with Unexpected Courage, multiple uses. But there's quite a bit of investment. You need to spend an action and 2 resources to even be able to use it. And then you'll need to have resources that you wouldn't be using for something better just lying around. The value goes up considerably if you do have extra resources, and if you are likely to test both the skills, and if you can play this at the beginning of a scenario. Speaking of playing things at the beginning of the scenario, most assets benefit from showing up early. Leo DeLuca gives you an extra action every turn. Incredible. But the cost is high. 6 resources. If you can't play him in the first half of the game, you aren't really getting the value from what you're paying. This can be a trap for assets in general. You might build a deck expecting that every asset in your deck will be in play, but by the time this happens, the game is nearly over, and you've spent many actions playing assets that go unused. It's tempting. You added the cards to your deck because you wanted to play them, but if the game is close to being over, you probably have better ways of using your actions and resources. Okay, next, let's go over what needs to happen in order for Barricade to be playable. There need to be non-elite enemies not at your location. They have to have Hunter. And you can't leave your location. Oh, and Hunter enemies generally spawn with you, not in some other location. The effect itself seems fine, you avoid attacks, but couldn't this card be something else? If you're barricading yourself in a location, it's probably to get clues undisturbed. Well, you might as well have had a card that helps you get the clues in the first place, and then just leave. I don't know, I can imagine having fun with this effect, but how often is it going to happen? Oh, of course it also wastes an action too. Finally, inefficient cards. Unfortunately, this is almost all of the level 0 healing options. For the most part, damage on your investigator card doesn't matter unless it defeats you. So healing generally isn't necessary until the end of the game. For first aid to do anything, you need to spend 2 resources and an action to play it. Then you spend another action to heal only 1 damage or 1 horror. With 2 actions and 2 resources, you should be able to progress the game so that it ends before you would have taken that final point of damage that would have defeated you. There are better healing cards out there, but this one just doesn't do enough with your precious actions. Okay, I'll finish things up here with some final thoughts. Action compression really does make a difference because getting ahead of the game can help you keep pace when the game wastes your time later. You never know when a huge obstacle might show up, but if you're already doing well early, you don't have to stress about not having enough time after you've dealt with the problem. Next, everything has an opportunity cost. You don't get your actions back when you spend them, and there are only so many that you'll have in the game. The same can be said about including cards in your deck. Is the card doing enough for you? Or could it have been something else that would have been better? Finally, the investigator you are playing and the role that you're playing your team will dictate how you should be spending your actions. Getting a feel for this takes some time and practice, as well as some coordination across the members of your team. But if everyone is contributing in their own way, everyone will have more fun and you will win more scenarios. That's the end of the strategy guide. We'll return to this series when I discuss passing skill tests. I hope you enjoyed thinking about the game, and now maybe you have some ideas for your next deck and campaign in Arkham Horror the card game. If you have some thoughts or questions, leave them in the comments below. And feel free to check out some of my other Arkham Horror videos here on the channel. I'll see you in the next one.